Okay, thank you. We're joining again the learning on Maseches Yoma. We started it maybe a couple of weeks ago, and we started at the beginning of the Masechta. And if I just remind you, the first Mishnah in Yoma dealt with the rule that the Kohen Gadol, who's going to perform all the avoda, all the service on Yom Kippurim, is separated from his community, and he's housed in a little chamber on the site of the Beis Hamikdash, and he's there for 7 days prior to the Yom Kippur ceremony. And basically there are two reasons. One is to ensure that he remains as far as possibly tahor, pure, doesn't encounter any tumah, which might invalidate him for carrying out the Yom Kippur service. And the second thing is, as we'll see later on, he's going to be primed and briefed on the elaborate procedure of the avoda of Yom Kippurim. And even if he does it every year, he still needs reminders every year, because he's going to be performing all the avodot in the Beis Hamikdash on his own in quick time. And so he needs briefing for that as well. So that was the din of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah gave us some other details as well. When we started to learn the Gemara asked the question, what's the source for this separation of 7 days for the Kohen Gadol? And I've given you a rationale for it, but the Gemara wanted a scriptural source which would indicate that the Kohen Gadol should be separated, not just a source that makes sense in terms of common sense, but also a scriptural source. And Rabbi Yochanan brought us a scriptural source, which I'll share with you in a moment, which we then went on to discuss because it had other consequences, not just for the separation of a Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, but for other events as well. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll look at that verse again.
Before you start, could you give a sort of timeline?
A timeline. We're talking here about the time of the Beis Hamikdash, when the Kohen Gadol is going to perform the avoda of Yom Kippurim, everything that we see in Parshas Achrei Mos. So if the Yom Kippur falls on the 10th of Tishri, it means that he's pulled out of his home, so to speak, or he walks out of his home for a 7-day separation period starting the 3rd of Tishri. And then he remains during that 7 days housed on the premises of the Beis Hamikdash. And that's the long and the short of it. And this is an annual event. Every year, the Kohen Gadol has these 7 days out, if you like, of his community when he's housed together with his with various Kohanim coming in and out. But only the Kohen Gadol is in this isolation. Every other Kohen is allowed to come and go as he pleases. So the Kohen Gadol will be entirely in the grounds of Beis Hamikdash during that period. And the Gemara wanted to have a scriptural source for this yearly separation of the Kohen Gadol. And so I was just about to share the screen. And we saw this last week. The Gemara brought the source from another halacha where the Torah is explicit about a 7-day separation period. There's nothing in the Chumash and Achrei Mos that describes Yom Kippur to suggest that the Kohen Gadol needs 7 days of separation, but there is something explicit on another ceremony, and that ceremony often called the Miluim, which we looked at this last week, and I'm doing some chazorah because we're going to go forward from here. And the Miluim, which I called the dedication, but really it's the inauguration of the Kohanim rather than just the Mishkan. The Miluim, it's like the Miluim now, in the army, you go every year for a reserve type of service, an annual service. But the Miluim over here was the period during which the Kohanim were brought up to scratch before they actually started to be on duty themselves in the Mishkan. This is at the beginning of any form of avodah, because the Mishkan is the prototype for the Beis Hamikdash. So this period, which is, again, we'll see this in Parsha Shmini in Sefer Vayikra, And if I read this verse and you see what the Pasuk says, this is talking about really the Kohen Gadol. Umid Pesach Ohel Moed Lo Seitzu Shivas Yomim. And perhaps the other Kohanim who were with him at the time during this pre-inauguration period for 7 days before they completed their first avodah. They were not allowed to leave the Ohel Moed. The ordination, the inauguration, requires 7 days of separation. That's what Lo Seitzu Shivas Yomim means. Normally, the Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol, live in the camp of the Jewish people in the Midbar, in the wilderness. But during the 7-day period, they had to remain within the Ohel Moed, which is within the precincts and the fencing, if you like, of the Mishkan in the Midbar. So this is a prototype need for 7 days separation. And the Pasuk went on, the next Pasuk actually, went on to say, Kasha osa b'yom hazeh, tziva Hashem la'asos lechaper aleichem. We don't need to go through the detail of what this second Pasuk means. We did that last week. The only important thing for us to know is these words lechaper aleichem in this verse, which refers really to the ordination of the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol, Aaron, in the time of the Mishkan, is extrapolated to apply to every Yom Kippur. It talks about not going out for 7 days. And even though this Pasuk is in reference to the Miluim, the fact that the Pasuk ends L'chaper aleichem in order to afford a kapara, well, actually, the Miluim was nothing to do with a kapara. So those two words seem to be out of place. So the Chazal determined from here that there is another time when 7 days separation is required. And that's when the Kohanim, or the Kohen Gadol specifically, is going to be mechaper aleichem. He's going to atone for you. Which day is there a day for atonement? Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur means the day of kaper, the day of kapara. So this was the source which the Gemara brought to require 7 days of separation for the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, because it's here for Miluim explicitly for the inauguration. And these two key words, lechaper aleichem, expands that need of 7 days separation, lo seitzu shivat yamim. It expands it to encompass also any time that the Kohen is going to perform a kapara. And he's going to perform the kapara on Yom Kippur. The Gemara brought various questions, but let's just leave those for a moment, because this is itself not entirely clear what I've said, and is certainly open to more questioning. The Gemara also said that we learned a Gezerah Shava, and we spent a long time on Gezerah Shavas last week, where it said Shiva Hashem, and we said that this also includes another occasion when a Kohen is going to need a 7-day separation period, not just Miluim, not just Yom Kippur, but also it's the Kohen who's preparing the ashes of the Parah Adumah, not the one who's sprinkling in order to be matar someone, but when a new Parah is needed and found, and its ashes are burnt, and a new stock of Parah Adumah fluid is prepared, which will be used to be metaher people who are Tomei Meis, then that preparation period, that preparation requires a prior 7 days of separation by the Kohen, often the Skan Kohen Gadol, the deputy Kohen Gadol, if you look in the Chumash, who's going to perform the shechting of the Parah Adumah, and then the burning of the flesh and ashes, and the mixing with the water and various other ceremonials to prepare the stock of water needed for purification ceremonies. So that Kohen himself also needs 7 days. So essentially, we're seeing over here the 3 occasions when Kohanim need to be pre-isolated for 7 days, if you like. The first is the source Pasuk, which deals, in fact, with the inauguration of the Mishkan. But you can see that as being a one-off event. The Mishkan was only inaugurated once. But with the second Pasuk, Chazal expanded to 2 other occasions and say 7-day separation is needed also for lechaper aleichem prior to Yom Kippur. You can't just walk in off the streets as a Kohen Gadol on Erev Yom Kippur and perform the ceremony of the avoda for Yom Kippur. You need to be installed in the Beis HaMikdash and separated first for 7 days. And similarly, a Kohen is preparing the ashes of the Parah Adumah for use, which was only done very, very occasionally, because once a Parah Adumah was prepared, the ashes would last for many generations sometimes. But when it was necessary to prepare a new stock of ashes for the Parah Adumah, it required also 7 days of separation for that Kohen in advance. And we'll have some idea of what's actually done during those 7 days as we go further in the Gemara. Now, last week, the Gemara asked various questions on the derivation. For example, I just said to you that the words lechaper alechem is a hint that we need 7 days separation for Yom Kippur as well. But the Gemara then went into long contortions looking at other occasions when the Torah talks about kapara and saying, well, how do you know this just applies to Yom Kippur? Every time the Kohen performs an avoda ceremony during the year as well, whether it's korban sibah or korban yochid, the general run-of-the-mill avoda done in the Beis HaMikdash on a daily basis is for kapara. The Torah often says so. It's not just Yom Kippur, which is for kapara. If a person is bringing a korban chatos because he has unwittingly transgressed on a serious aveira, he brings a korban. That korban is a kapara. And when the Kohen performs the avodah, shechts the korban, and then he places part of it on the mizbech, it's a kapara. So if you were to take these two words as broadly as possible, lechaper alechem, it would require essentially separation of every Kohen every day or in advance. So the Gemara, because that's a kapara, is a daily affair, not just a Yom Kippur affair. So this is where we discussed the subject last week and went into a number of logical reasons why it is not possible to say that we should expand it so far. And the Gemara eventually left off saying that it's only sensible to say lechaper alechem comes to include Yom Kippur, once a year event, and not a daily form of kapara service that the Kohen, any Kohen is doing, the non-Kohen Gadol as well. That wouldn't be right. The Gemara gave us various reasons for it. I'm actually going to move us on now and skip a bit of Gemara from where we left last time, because the Gemara is in the bits that I'm leaving out, which is one amud or so, one daf. It deals very much with the possible alternative ways of reading this pasuk, which are all dismissed, but dismissed after very long labyrinthine arguments, which are going to put everyone to sleep. But the Gemara is convinced that it has to find a fully reliable source for the need to separate a Kohen on Yom Kippur and Parah Adumah, and on those two occasions only. That's what all the Gemara we're missing is dealing with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, if you've got a sheet or if you've got the Gemara open, we're going to take it to low down on Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Just stop sharing for a moment. Low down on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, 3b, and we're looking to 4 lines from the bottom. Literally everything that comes before is the agonizing proof that it's only Yom Kippur and Parah Adumah which require these separations, apart from the Miluim, which is the inauguration source verse. And the Gemara starts there, the second word, Aleph Lamed, which is Omale, Omale, Elama Mehecha Yalefla. Omale, Elama Mehecha Yalefla. 4 lines from the bottom of Gimel Amud Beis. The second word is an abbreviation, Aleph Lamed Omale, unless you've got the full word spelt out. Some Gemaras may actually have the full words Omale. Elama Mehecha Yalefla. What's going on over here is that all the previous discussions were based upon the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan that the source for the isolation of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is from Miluim, as I've just explained to you, because it says Lechaper Alechem, and Lechaper Alechem indicates that it's needed not just for the inauguration ceremony, but for the occasion of Kippur, of Kapara, which is taken to be Yom Kippur. And we've been through that, and that's fine. However, Reish Lakish, the usual sparring partner of Rabbi Yochanan, disagrees with this source and does not believe that this is the correct source for requiring the Kohen Gadol to be separated for 7 days in advance. And we'll see why as he questions, as Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish enter into a dialogue. But Rabbi Yochanan's view that it comes from Elohim is just his view. The Reish Lakish, with whom he argues, has an alternative source, and we can look at this now. So Amalei, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, to Reish Lakish, and we just missed out those words from earlier on, where do you don't agree with me that the source for the separation before Yom Kippur for 7 days is from the inauguration of Aaron at the time of the dedication of the Mishkan? So Elamah, the master, you, addressing him in the third person, where do you learn this out from? If you don't learn it out from the din of Miluim, but you agree it is necessary, everyone agrees it is necessary, where do you learn it out from? You must have an alternative source. So he says, yes, I'll tell you what my alternative source is. So Amalei, and it's a very surprising one that should really send us wondering. Amalei, Misinai, from the Har Sinai, from the Mount Sinai experience. This is where we know the din of 7 days of celebration. How so? Dichsev. So let's just look at the posuk first. Just looking at the Gemara, then I'll share a screen and make it clearer where Reish Lakish's derivation is going to be, which will require 7 days of separation. Dichsev. The posuk says, and this is actually in Mishpatim. If you look at Sefer Shemos, there's a little bit of confusion, even amongst the Rishonim and Acharonim, how to understand the whole procedure of Har Sinai, how it started, when various events mentioned in Parshas Yisro and Mishpatim took place. There's some major machlokusim, and the problem is that the main Matan Torah extract appears in Parshas Yisro, as you know. That's where we see the Aseres Adibros appear. It's the 10 Commandments on Parshas Yitro. And the preceding statements and dialogue between Moshe and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Bnei Yisrael, and telling people not to go up the mountain, and all the rules, they all come in Parshas Yisro. However, suddenly in Parshas Mishpatim, there's a whole group of psukim that seem to hearken back to the Har Sinai experience. And this is where there is a disagreement amongst the commentaries as to whether these psukim that we see in Mishpatim actually are just a late throwback to what was going on in Yisro, or whether they relate to an event after Har Sinai, immediately after. Why are they in Mishpatim? Mishpatim's after Yisro. Maybe it's referring to something that happened after the 10 Commandments were given, after the Luchos. Or maybe they actually relate to the earlier events, because we know sometimes the Torah is written out of sync. And so maybe they really should have been in Yisro, but for some reason we don't know, they were in Mishpatim. This is one of the group of Mishpatim Sukkim. That does play a little bit of a role in our logic. But let's just read it first of all from our Gemara. Amalei, Misinai, because Dichsiv, it's written in Parshas Mishpatim, Vayishkon Kavod Hashem al Har Sinai, that the, if you like, the Shekhinah, the honor, the glory of God dwelt on Har Sinai. Vayechasehu he'onon sheishes yomim, and the cloud covered him for 6 days. Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi'i, and Hashem called to Moshe on the 7th day. This is all in Mishpatim. So I'll look at that in a moment online, but let's just carry on the next few words. Michteiksiv. So don't we see in the posuk that it is written, Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi'i, Hashem called to Moshe on the 7th day. He said, Moshe, come along, I want to give you the Luchos Habris. Let's assume that's what he wants to do. So my Sheishes Yomim, why does it say that prior to that, the cloud covered him for 6 days? So says Reish Lakish, Zeh b'nei Av. This is a binyan Av. This is a model prototype, not just for Har Sinai, but for all future generations. It's quite a leap, this statement of Reish Lakish. What? Shekol hanichnas b'machaneh hashchina, that anyone who wishes to enter into the vicinity of the divine presence, if you like, ta'un prishas shisha, need 6 days of prior separation. The 6 days under the cloud are the 6 days of prior separation. And in any situation in the future, not just in Har Sinai, when a Kohen Gadol is going to wish to enter into the Holy of Holies, which is the vicinity of the Shekhinah, he will also need 6 days of separation. It's a very big leap. Let me just share the screen with you because it's a surprising drasha. One always thinks, I'm going to move further on. One always thinks of the stories in the Torah, the Sippurim, the Agadot, if you like, not the halachic parts, but the telling parts. And of course, the whole story of Har Sinai is a telling part. It tells you what happens. It was thundering, it was lightning, the mountain was surrounded, Moshe went up, the people were told to remain below. We think of those as not being halachic themselves. They're just telling you what happened. They're recounting an event. However, over here, we will see that the Gemara is using this event to derive a halachic rule. It's not just a one-off. It's something that's teaching us more than what happened simply at the Har Sinai. So let's look at the psukim here. The pasuk says, "Vayoma Hashem el Moshe." I'm giving you some of the earlier psukim, so you see the run-up. The Gemara always brings you that last pasuk, which contains just the words you need out of context. So I'm bringing you the early psukim, so you get the atmosphere of these psukim. Vayom Hashem el Moshe, alei alai hahara, come up to me to the mountain, said Hashem, v'heyesham, and be there, v'etna lacha as luchos ha'even, v'hatorah v'hamitzvos asher kosavti lahorosam. Again, remember, this is in Mishpatim, not in Yisro. It's written after Matan Torah in Yisro. And I will give to you the tablets of stone, which are engraved with the Torah and the mitzvahs, for you to teach them. Okay, next pasuk. Vayokom Moshe v'Yehoshua misharso. And Moshe and Yehoshua arose. Vaya'al Moshe el har ho Elohim. And Moshe himself ascended up the mountain. Ve'el haskenim Amar, and he instructed the elders, Shavu na bazer, you better stay here, ad asher noshev alechem, until we return. V'hine Aharon v'chu imachem, mi bal devarim yigash alehem. And very cute over here. One doesn't notice. This is we read this in Mishpatim every year, but we don't notice what this pasuk means. You know what he's saying over here? He's saying, you know what? While I'm away, I don't know how long I'm going to be away. But I've delegated fill-ins for me. Anyone who has a problem, a leadership problem, or a she'ela, or a complaint, take it to Aaron, my brother, or Hur, and they will be the Baal Devarim. They will act on my behalf. So in fact, before Moshe actually goes up, he does put into place some deputies to follow, to look after the situation back at base camp. Okay, v'yal Moshe lohar, and Moshe then ascended, v'yachas he'onon es hahar, and then the cloud covered the mountain. Now here's the pasuk we just did in the Gemara, just this pasuk. V'yishkon kvod Hashem al Har Sinai, and during this period, the honor, the glory of God, which means his Shekhinah's divine presence, rested on Har Sinai. Vayachasehu he'onon sheishes yomim, and the cloud covered him for 6 days. What happened during those 6 days? Absolutely nothing. We don't know. And then, Vayikral Moshe b'yom hashvi'i mitoch he'onon, God called Moshe on the 7th day from the cloud. And again, this is a detail you probably missed when you learned Mishpatim. as we always do. Only the Gemara here is telling you to put your mind to it so you don't miss it again next year. What happened over here? Moshe goes up the mountain. That mountain is now enveloped with cloud. And for a period of 6 days, not 7 days, the Gemara is going to remark 6 and a 7. Don't worry, 6 equals 7 for the moment. Yes, imagine that you're a strange form of scientist who've been proven 6 equals 7. So don't raise any problems at this point. The cloud covered Moshe for 6 days, during which absolutely nothing happened. Moshe was in a period of suspended animation, waiting for the call. It was complete dark around him. You can imagine Moshe sitting on a rock saying, how long is it going to be before I get my call to see, His Majesty, the Shekhinah? And he waits. And only on the 7th day does HaKadosh Baruch Hu call him. What do we see? This is a prototype for a period of 6 days of isolation and separation prior to entering into the Shekhinah, because the Shekhinah, if you like, Moshe enters into the presence of Hashem only the 7th day, when Hashem calls Moshe from the cloud, come out and approach me. During those 6 days, he's as if he were the Kohen Gadol in the Lishkas Parahedrin, waiting for the call for Yom Kippur. It's a beautiful, what shall I say? It's a mashal, if you like, to what will happen in the future of the Kohen Gadol. But the Moshe is not in a chamber. He's covered by clouds. He's under those clouds. Those clouds are his isolation chamber. Okay, so the Gemara said, or this is the opinion of Reish Lakish, that this is the source for the requirement of the Kohen Gadol to be separated for 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. Just like Moshe had to separate himself for 6 days before receiving the luchos from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so the Kohen Gadol, who is also going to be make himself an entry into the presence of the Shekhinah in the Kodesh Kadoshim, needs to separate himself out for 7 days. Okay, there's a problem with this limud. Really, this is a very difficult pasuk to understand how the Gemara's got what it's got out of it, and Tosas brings this out as well. Because it's very clear that we're talking here about one-off event on Har Sinai. Hashem says, you're going to see me, so to speak, in person, ponim el ponim, when you receive the lochos, on this one-off event, at one point in history, you need to have a 6-day period within the onon. Where do we see from this that it should be applied to all future generations of high priests for 7 days before they enter into the Yom Kippur Avodah? What right do we have to extrapolate this to say it's a source? It's very nice, but it's all related to Har Sinai, and Har Sinai experience is very one-off. So how can we then extrapolate it to every year before the Kohen Gadol performs the Avodah? This is the question. It's a question against the derivation here of Reish Lakish. And the words used over here, Zeh B'nei Av, Binyan Av, means that we can see this to be a prototype for all future periods. Where do we see this to be a prototype for all future periods? There's no good answer for this. In other words, this particular derivation is problematic. The way the Gemara tries to say it is because maybe it's repeating itself. What does the pasuk say here? Look at the pasuk again. Vayechasehu he'onon sheishes yomim. That the cloud covered for 6 days. Vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi'i. And then Hashem called Moshe on the 7th day. There's a bit of redundancy in the verse. Tosas says the pasuk could have said, and the cloud covered him, and then Vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi'i. It doesn't have to talk about 6 and then 7. It could have gone straight into the 7. It could have done that. It's not as if there's anything wrong with the way the pasuk wrote it, but if you say what is absolutely necessary, the only thing we need to know is that God called to the Moshe the 7th day after he ascended up Har Sinai. Why do we have to know that there was a cover over Moshe for 6 days? So perhaps because of this additional redundant information and stress, Reish Lakish believes that this is an indication that we should take the 6 days of separation further than just this particular one-off occasion to Har Sinai, and applied also to the Yom Kippur ceremony as well, because he's going to be in the vicinity of the Shekhinah in the same way each year on Yom Kippur. Problematic a little bit. I just raise it with you because very often we find that the Gemara brings a drasha, and we strain to understand how the drasha is watertight. But it could be the Gemara sees a certain redundancy over here, and therefore believes this is meant to be a remez to us, that we should apply it more generally to the Kohen Gadol on a yearly basis. Okay. But now the Gemara asks, let me just stop sharing screen for a moment, a very starkly obvious question, which I mentioned. I said to you before, just imagine the 6 equals 7, which is a bit of a chutzpah. The Gemara says over here, V'ho'anan shivotanan, our Mishnah that talks about the days of separation from the Yom Kippur. They don't talk about 6 days of separation. I'm afraid you're one out in this verse, Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, you've brought us a verse to show that Moshe was in isolation, so to speak, for 6 days. And only on the 7th day was he called by Kodesh Baruch Hu. Well, in that case, there should only be 6 days separation for the Kohen Gadol. Why are there 7 days separation? 6 is not equal to 7, says the Gemara over here. So the Gemara wants an explanation for Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is using it as a proof to the 7th day, 7 days of separation Kohen Gadol, which is not because the source is 6 and he wants to give us 7 days for the Kohen Gadol. So the Gemaric answers what Reish Lakish would say to try and explain away this divergence between 6 and 7. No, 6 doesn't equal 7, but let's see why he requires 7 for the Kohen Gadol, even though the source posuk is only 6. So says the Gemara, Masnisin, this is going towards the bottom of Gimel Amud Beis, our Mishnah, which says that it requires 7 days of separation, even though the source verse correctly, as you pointed out, only requires 6, is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. It's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who adds his own additional gloss, if you like, on this verse. Why? Dechayish, because he's concerned, and here we move on to Daled Amud Aleph 4a, top of the page, Letumas Beso, to a possibility that the Kohen Gadol might become Tomei in his house way before he even went into separation. What does this mean? So here's the chashash, the problem that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira has, which requires him to increase the separation period from 6 days to 7. 6 days is what the Torah seems to suggest at Sinai, says Reish Lakish. That's true. But there is a possibility that 6 days may not work. Why not? So what are we saying now? Let's imagine there was only 6 days separation. I'll tell you what the problem is, says Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. If there is only 6 days of separation, what that means is that prior to Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would have been 6 days away from his home. He'll have been 6 days away from his home. But on the day that he left home, which was 6 days earlier on, he would have been together with his wife. Now, here's the far-fetched possibility that something might go wrong. And it's got to do with Tumah and Tara in terms of intimate relationships between the husband and the wife. Nothing to do with a 6 or a 7 as far as a source verse is concerned, but very much a domestic problem. What's a domestic problem? Suppose that he has intimate relations with his wife 6 days earlier, and you only give him 6 days of separation. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se, because it doesn't make him Tomei. It doesn't make you Tomei if you have a wife and you have relationships with her. There used to be some rabbinic sort of thing about we're going to the mikveh at night until the next morning, but even that isn't done anymore. Certainly would not invalidate the Kohen Gadol performing the avoda, the fact that he'd had relations with his wife 6 days earlier. But just suppose by some terrible act of fate, I shouldn't say fate, by Kodesh Baruch Hu so makes this, that his wife becomes a nida within minutes, so shall we say, or just a minute before he has his intimate relationships with her. So he will have had a relationship with his wife while she was a niddah, and it's possible. It's just bad luck, bad timing. So what? Well, there is a din that a person who has a relationship with his wife while she's a niddah, it means that he has to be, he is tomei for 7 days. And nowadays, we don't have this whole thing with tum and tara anyway. But as far as a Kohen is concerned, it was invalidate him in the unlucky circumstance that he was only separated for 6 days. And on that day before he left, he had relations with his wife, and at the relationship point, she just became a niddah, so that he essentially unwittingly violated the having relationship with a woman during niddah. And there is a 7-day period during which he's only going to be tahor after he's gone to the mikveh. Then if you only give him 6 days separation, he won't be able to perform the service in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur, because it's only 6 days he's had of separation. There's only been 6 days since he might have had his last relationship with his wife, who might have been a niddah, and that would be insufficient. And we're concerned about that. And by the way, we may not know. We may never know whether she became a niddah. We're not trying to say we find out. No one gives us a phone call. Since that is feasible, they decided to stretch the 6 days to 7 days, because after 7 days, it becomes tahor anyway. So if there's a 7-day period of separation, even if the worst had happened at the last night he spent with her, he would still be tahor and be able to do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. So this is the answer given. Why 6 equals 7? No, the source posuk for separation before you enter into the Shekhinah is only 6 days. If you go like Reish Lakish, you learn it from the din of Sinai, the events at Har Sinai, but that extra day is because of this, unfortunate potential event that might make him tomei. So therefore, we up it from 6 to 7, and this is where this is essentially where Reish Lakish, for the moment before Rabbi Yochanan will question him, rests his case. So I say the source is from Sinai, where we see there is a necessity to separate yourself out for 6 days before being in the presence of the Shekhinah. And the Kohen Gadol is going to be in presence of the Shekhinah when he goes into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. So he needs to be separated for 6 days. The Mishnah says 7 days. Well, that's an extra day because of this additional fear that he may have unwittingly had contact with his wife while she was a niddah, and 6 days would not be sufficient for him to get over that particular tum'ah. Okay, so fine, but now Rabbi Yochanan's unhappy with Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan is going to try and find flaws, F-L-A-W-S, in Reish Lakish's argument that the source is Har Sinai. Remember, Rabbi Yochanan says it all comes from Miluim. It comes from this period of inauguration where we see clearly that a Kohen, Aaron, had to be separated for 7 days before, and 7 equals 7 there. There's no need for this extra Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. It's explicitly 7 days, and that applies for Yom Kippur as well. He is going to now try and prove that Reish Lakish's derivation doesn't make sense. Okay, so let's carry on with the Gemara. So Amalei, we're on the top line, the third word. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, I challenge you on your derivation. Ledidi, and we'll have to explain why. He's going to give you a halacha, which is going to be a problem for Reish Lakish. Bishlama ledidi. It'll work out okay, according to my opinion, that the derivation is from the inauguration. The Yafina Mimiluim, as I said, I learn out the din of 7 days separation for the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur from the din of the inauguration of the Kohen during in the Midbar. Hainu de Tanya, that will explain the following brisa. My explanation, my derivation is in line with the following brisa, but your derivation is not going to be in line with them. What's the following brisa? Hainu de Tanya, that will explain the brisa. What does the brisa say? Zeh v'zeh. Zeh v'zeh here means in both this case and that case. Actually, we're talking of the two cases here. We're quoting a brisa in midstream, as always. You've got to know what the background is. The brisa is saying that in both the situation, during the 7-day period of separation of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, and of that of the Kohen preparing the Parah Adumah. We're not looking at the Miluim for a moment, right? The two derived cases we talked about before, the Yom Kippur separation, 7 days, the Kohen who's about to prepare the new Parah Adumah, is going to shecht it and burn the ashes, a prior 7-day separation. During that period, zer v'zer, in both these instances, mazin olav kol shiva mikol chataos. It's an interesting little rule we didn't know about. They do a hazor, they do a sprinkling on the Kohen in both these instances, on the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen preparing the Parah Adumah. A sprinkling ceremony happens each day, Kol Shiva, all 7 days, Mikol Chata'os Shahayu Sham, from all the Parah Adumahs that have ever been made. We'll explain that in a moment. But what we're saying is that let me start again. The Kohen Gadol who's separated during the 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, and the Kohen who's going to prepare the Parah Adumah, they're not just sitting there sucking their thumbs for 7 days. Well, I mean, they're doing other things as well, but there is another ritual which they have to undergo. And what is that ritual? Is that every day, once a day, a Kohen will sprinkle some of this holy water, Parah Adumah water, the one that would normally make a person tahar if he's a tomei mace, that will purify a person. A daily ritual of sprinkling on him takes place both for the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur and the one preparing the Parah each day for that 7-day periods. And it says Mikol Chataos Shahayu Sham. This is an interesting idea. It's really very strange. It seems that on the Har HaBayis, in the vicinity of the Beis HaMikdash, they collected samples over the whole of history, not samples, I would say, a small amount of each Parah Adumah water that had been prepared was left in perpetuity in flasks, if you like, on the Har HaBayis, so that, and it would only be used on very, very spare occasions. I mean, it's always the latest Parah Adumah that was burnt, that we had huge amounts of stock from, that was used to purify someone. But what about the Parah Adumah that was shechted 8 years ago, which we've almost run out of? A little sample was taken before it was used and put in a separate flask. What about the Parah Adumah that was shechted in Moshe Rabbeinu's time, or the time of Ezra HaSopher, whoever it is? There was a little sample of all the Parah Adumah liquids going right back through history, which had been preserved. If you can imagine nowadays, it's a horrible thing. You might go into a museum, you say, you see these dried up skulls of different people at different times. There were small preserves of all the previous Parah Adumahs that hadn't been used up and deliberately related there. So you could say, this one is the Parah Adumah of, 1844. This one is 1553. They might have been labeled. And the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur and the Kohen who's going to prepare the latest Parah Adumah would have a little bit, maybe a little flick of each of those previous samples flicked on him as well. That's an interesting aside over here. Okay, why? I don't know. Why? This sounds like some sort of historical exercise. Ask Rabbi Wein why we go into this, go into past history and use even the earlier Parah Adumahs. But in any case, that was sprinkled on to the 2 occasions that that 7-day separation was needed, prior to Yom Kippur and the preparation of the Parah Adumah. And he says, now that is well understandable, only according to my derivation. I learned it from the Din of Miluim. I said 7-day separation are needed because I derived it from the posset that deals with the inauguration. Why? Why is that logical? To have a nami hazor b'miluim, because there's another detail that you didn't know, which is that sprinkling was also part of the affair, the daily affair prior to the inauguration of those Kohanim. In other words, I haven't been brought you the posset, but Let me just take you back to sharing screen. We're going back to Miluim, because this is Rabbi Yochanan saying that my derivation from Miluim is a good one. These psukim here, said we Pesach Oelmo lo Yetseitzu Shivas Yomim, etc. Adu Melois Yomei Meluichem. These were the psukim dealing with the Miluim. There is a posuk in this bunch, which I haven't brought, which says that Moshe sprinkled water over the 1 second. It wasn't water. He sprinkled certain blood on the on Aharon during the 7-day period of the inauguration. So says Rabbi Yochanan, it makes sense now why there is also a sprinkling for the Kohen Gadol prior to Yom Kippur, and in the case of the Kohen going to prepare the Parah Adumah, because since the 7-day separation is learnt out from the din of the inauguration, so therefore we take some of the other contents of the inauguration. Since the inauguration ceremony required a sprinkling, so therefore they would say naturally that the separation period of the Kohen Gadol and that of the one preparing the Parah Adumah would also require a sprinkling, right? Because one is derived from the other. So the content of those 7 days should be similar. However, says the Rabbi Yochanan, but according to you, Reish Lakish, the Yalfa to Misinai, you're learning out this whole need for a 7-day separation period from this whole ceremonial Har Sinai, where Moshe is covered by a cloud and all this business, and he's called on the 7th day. That's your source for the separation of the Kohen Gadol. That's your source. But Hazor B'Sinai Mihavai, was there any content of sprinkling on Har Sinai? There wasn't. Actually, there was, but let's just leave that question aside for the moment. But let's imagine there wasn't, because in fact, there wasn't for this purpose of purification anyway. There is no need to sprinkle Moshe. Was Moshe sprinkled when he was under this cloud? No. I don't think anyone could sprinkle anything on him because there was no one anywhere near him. So during his period of separation, on Har Sinai, there was no sprinkling. So says Rabbi Yochanan to Reish Lakish, it makes sense according to me that there should be a sprinkling on the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, for example, because that's learned from Miluim, where I say, says Rabbi Yochanan, where there was sprinkling during the 7 days. But you're learning this whole deal of separation from Har Sinai. But at Har Sinai, there was no sprinkling. How can you explain, therefore, that the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur during those 7 days is sprinkled? It's come out of nowhere. This sprinkling need for the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur isn't coming from any source. According to me, it comes from the source case. The source case is inauguration. Inauguration has sprinkling. And therefore, the Kohen Gadol in its separation period before Yom Kippur will also have sprinkling. But if your source is Har Sinai didn't have sprinkling. So why should there be sprinkling? And the Brisa says there is. Why should there be sprinkling for the 7-day separation before Yom Kippur? So the Gemara, so what happens now actually is a very Jewish thing. Reish Lakish answers the kasha against him with a kasha against Rabbi Yochanan. He's going to say it's not better with you. He admits this is a good question. Yes, a good question. Where did I get my need? Where do I explain the need to sprinkle in the case of a Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur? I agree. It's not in the source verse that I say it should be derived from Sinai. It's not in the Sinai. It has come out of nowhere. I agree. But he says, Rabbi Yochanan, you're forgetting something. You're also in trouble on this. If I'm in trouble, you're in trouble. And if we're both in trouble, don't bother to question me, essentially. Why are you also in trouble, Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan says that it derives from the din of Miluim. Yes. Now let's look what the problem is, Rabbi Yochanan. So it says, Omelei. So Rabbi Rish Lakish says, Rabbi Yochanan, Ula Taimech, according to your reasoning that it comes from the inauguration period, from the Miluin, Minecha, are you any better off in explaining the sprinkling of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur? You aren't. You know why you're not better off? The Miluim dam hachamayim. He says, it's true that in the Miluim there was sprinkling, but it was a different sprinkling. In the time of the Miluim, if you look, it says it says there, vayazer dam, that Moshe sprinkled blood on Aharon during the 7-day period of the inauguration, whereas the sprinkling on the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur is the Para Aduma water. It's not the same. So Reish Lakish says, Rabbi Yochanan, you're questioning me because because there's a din of sprinkling of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippurim, whereas my source din on Har Sinai doesn't have any sprinkling. Well, let me question you. Your source is the Miluim, where admittedly there was sprinkling, but it was sprinkling of blood. Whereas the requirement for a Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur is not to sprinkle blood on him, but to sprinkle Mei Porah, the water of the Porah Duma. So you're also in trouble. How is it better for you? Yes, there's a sprinkling, but it's a different sprinkling. It's like apples and pears. The sprinkling of blood is not the same as the sprinkling of water. So he's saying, Rabbi Yochanan, you're not really much better off than me. The question against me is, why is there any sprinkling at all? I agree. The question against you is, why is there sprinkling of water on the Kohen Gadol with Yom Kippur when it should have been a sprinkling of blood? But it's still a question against you. You haven't come out smelling of roses out of all this. Your derivation doesn't help you explain why there should be a sprinkling of water over the Kohen Gadol. Should have been blood. So here Rabbi Yochanan is going to answer this kasha. Rabbi Yochanan says, that's not a good kasha against me. Blood and water, reminded with saying blood is thicker than water. Over here, he says blood isn't thicker than water. It's much the same. We'll see why he says this in a moment. Hollow kasha. The fact that I agree there's a requirement to sprinkle water over the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, even though the source from which it comes shows that blood was spilt at the time of the Miluim, of the inauguration. That is low kasha. It's not going to be difficult for me because I can explain it. Why? The Tani, because we learnt in a brisa that Rabbi Chia, he taught this in a brisa, Nichnasu mayim tachas dam. Water enters in the place of blood. We'll explain this in a moment. Ela ledidach hazor b'hasinai maya mihave. The problem is only with you, because on Har Sinai there was no sprinkling, and yet nowadays we do require sprinkling over the Kohen Gadol, and you can't answer that question. But I can answer your question. How is he answering it over here with the words Nichnusu mayim tachas dam? It's actually quite straightforward, the answer that he's giving over here. He's saying, I don't have a problem with the original source case of Miluim requiring blood sprinkling, whereas I say later on the Kohen Gadol requires water sprinkling. That's not a question, because we're talking here about two different episodes in history, if you like, two different time periods. The Miluim, this whole inauguration of the Mishkan, we're talking about the very earliest embryonic stages of the Mishkan in the Midbar, even before the first korbanos are offered up. We're inaugurating the Kohanim. We're making them fit to perform the service. Is there any Parah Aduma at that time? Of course not. We're nowhere near Parah Aduma yet. We haven't prepared any water for sprinkling. What can we sprinkle in a moment? Yeah, I mean, you could say you can sprinkle tap water. You could say you could sprinkle, bottled water that you buy in the local supermarket. But, that the Gemara is going to not really interested in that. If there is no holy water, if you like, Parah Aduma water to sprinkle at this very first stage in the Miluim, the only thing that makes sense to sprinkle is the dam from a korban, is blood from a korban. That explains the original sprinkling at the very first stage having to come from dam, because there was no alternative of sprinkling with a Parah Aduma. The Parah Aduma is usually the purifying water, but there was no purifying water. Now later on, when we come to the Kohen Gadol and he needs to be prepared 7 days before Yom Kippurim, we're talking about when there's a Beis Hamikdash. We're talking about or when the Mishkan is fully available. We're not talking about this prototype pre-entry stage. By this time, we already have a Paraduma. We're in the Paraduma age. We have Paraduma water. So that's why the sprinkling that takes place on the Kohen Gadol prior to Yom Kippurim is taken from the water of the Paraduma. Before there's a Paraduma, it can only come from Dam. That's why the source case of Miluim has it on Dam. Later on that we have a Paraduma. That's Mayim, Nichnusim Mayim Tachas Dam. The water of the Paraduma comes and takes the place of what had been blood sprinkling prior to the preparation of Paraduma. So Rabbi Yochanan's explained how the halacha that there is sprinkling of the Paraduma water on the Kohen Gadol prior to Yom Kippurim is consistent with the ceremony of the inauguration of the Mishkan, which required blood. And therefore, he's defended his explanation and his source. The question now is only with Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish doesn't have such a defense. Reish Lakish has brought Har Sinai as his source. At Har Sinai, there is no sprinkling. So why should there be a sprinkling on the Kohen Gadol prior to Yom Kippur? There's no source, there's no makor. So how is he going to answer? And we will just do these. Answer is very, very simple, which is a getaway answer. Reish Lakish. Amalei, says Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan. Oh, I agree, there's no source. All right, fine. You've answered your point. Well, I'll answer my point. It's true that at Har Sinai there was no sprinkling. And today there is a sprinkling prior to the Kohen Gadol entering on Yom Kippur. He gets sprinkled with the water of the chatos of the Paraduma. But you know why? Mala ba'alma. Mala means chumrah. The word mala means it's a chumrah. In other words, I don't have to, at the end of the day, I'm not even interested in your question anymore. You're looking for me to try and prove that Har Sinai there was sprinkling. I know there wasn't sprinkling. I'm not going to make up something for you. However, that was a one-off. That was Har Sinai. There was no sprinkling. Nowadays, we've got all sorts of technology today, haven't we? We've got a Kohen Gadol. We've got a Beis Hamikdash. We've got a Paraduma. So we do what we can. We do a chumrah. There is no source for the sprinkling of the holy waters on the Kohen Gadol 7 days before, but a chumrah is also a good reason to do it. When you after all, the waters of the Mei Para that we sprinkle on are purification waters. And what better things to do than to try and keep the to sprinkle on the Kohen Gadol? He doesn't need it. We're not saying he's Tomei. Let's be careful over here. It is only a chumrah. When you do apply under normal halakhic reasons a paraduma and sprinkle it on a person, we know the person is Tomei Mace. And then there's on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, that's the ritual. Over here, you have a Kohen Gadol that you believe is tahor. Nevertheless, it's a nice thing to do. So the chumrah here is a bit decorative. It's cosmetic more than anything else. There's no real reason to sprinkle him, but it's nice to do. And I'm reminded of the fact, look, a man doesn't have to go to mikveh nowadays, but there are a lot of men who go to mikveh Erev Shabbos. I know people in Golders Green who used to go to the mikveh every day after Shachris. They would ask them why, give me the makar. So they would say to me, Mala, it's just a chumrah. I feel better. Some people feel better after a cold shower on a hot day. Some people feel better when they come out of the mikveh. They feel somehow purified. I mean, women also say that it makes a big difference to them. But even a man who has no need to go to mikveh at all may have a reason to feel that there's something that the mikveh water provides to him. Over here, we're talking about the sprinkling of the paraduma water. No necessity for it, but nevertheless, there's something magic about it. And Reish Lakish will say that's the reason that it's done, not because there's a makor. So at this point, as we're going to end this share anyway, both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish have given us sources for the 7-day separation. Rabbi Yochanan, it was from the Miluim, the inauguration of the Kohanim, and from the perspective of Reish Lakish, it comes from Har Sinai. There are questions thrown backwards and forwards, but at this point, there's a goalless draw, or maybe it's a goal, 1-1 or whatever it is. And we have two potential sources for the separation of a Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur each year. And I'm going to just quit